Hello, this is Jonathan Lampel here with Blender HD, and welcome to the third part of my video tutorials series on how to make a scene realistic inside of Blender. So this picture shows where we left off last time. We did the lighting and the detailing in the first two parts of this series, and now we're going to go over materials. So I have the feeling that this is going to take a little bit longer, maybe not as long as the last section, but it will take a little bit. So I'm just going to go ahead and jump straight in. So here we have our scene, and we definitely need to add a material to everything, and we need to add, textures and all that stuff. So I'm going to be going through piece by piece and just kind of showing you the different things that we can do with each object. And what I like about the scene is each different piece presents different challenges that I can show you how to work through. So let's go ahead and get started. Up here, there you have your layout options, and I think I covered this in a quick tip. This is like my first video, and I have already set up a layout for materials, and this is really handy because I can use this window here as my preview window. So I can be previewing this while I'm selecting or editing objects here, and I have a timeline if I'm doing an animation. I have my material options right here. And also I have my node editing, and so this is a really intuitive workflow just set up so that I can quickly access everything, and it just works super well. Also, by pressing the Control right arrow, I can get to my UV editing tools, which is, as you can see, the next one in the sequence. It goes materials, then editing, and so I can just quickly jump between these two by pressing the Control key and the arrow. So let's go ahead and texture a couple things first. So these textures I did grab off of CG Textures, except for a couple of them. CG Textures is just a texture website. You do have to have a subscription, but it is free, and you get a certain quota per week, and it has a bunch of really great textures, a bunch of different categories, and it's super helpful. So I definitely recommend them for getting textures. Alright, so as you're going and choosing textures beforehand, or whether you're doing it on the fly, you have to kind of think of what kind of scene you're making. For instance, here we kind of have a rundown, dirty kind of feel. So I got kind of ground that is all, cracked, it looks grungy, and it also has these cracks with dirt in it. And I chose this for a specific reason, and it's because these cracks make it look like it's possible that the grass can be sticking up out of it. If this was just a flat concrete, slab, it would be kind of impossible to have those little grass shoots. But since they have all these cracks, it looks a whole lot better and looks much more natural to have the grass sticking out, and just kind of adds a lot more detail. For the curb, I'm going to be using this texture, just kind of a regular cracked texture. For the wall, I'm going to be using this, also kind of a grunge map, and I like this down here because it kind of adds a little bit of a backdrop where it meets the floor with, you can have some grunge build up. And I chose a couple posters. I think a couple of these I got off Google Images, so I'm not 100% sure on the copyright on these, which is always a bad idea, but since this is just kind of a I don't know, going through, they just seem to fit, be kind of grungy posters, so it worked well. Also, the sign I chose was also from CG Textures, and as you can tell, it's very grungy. A lot of the signs there were very clean, and actually the original sign that was on the barrels here was, flawlessly clean, which would be impossible in real life. So make sure that everything you do, every texture you choose, is based on what the scene is going to be about, and it'll make a whole lot more sense, and it'll just work out, and they'll complement each other much better. So let's go ahead and do the wall texture first. I think that's a good, simple place to start. So one thing that I can do is I can, when I select this wall, I can press numpad/, and what that does is put us into local mode, so such that as I now go into preview, I can preview it super fast. I don't have to worry about the other objects, and I'm not distracted by anything else, and I can work solely on that. While in this window, I see it within its context, so that's very helpful. So let's go ahead and add a new material. I'm going to call this one wall. Pretty creative, I know. And when you're making your materials, especially in cycles, you have to think of how objects interact with light. So a concrete wall isn't very reflective. It doesn't refract light. It's not very, velvety or whatever. Sometimes I would add a little bit of glossy to my concrete. I've done that in a few images, but it's just really subtle and helps it stand out a little bit. But in this image, since it's just a flat wall, let's go with diffuse. So I'm going to press Shift A and add a texture, an image texture. And then I will just go ahead and open my texture that I have for the wall. Now, it's really difficult to choose which texture out of this kind of list. You can't really see what's what, but if you check this arrow, especially if they're badly named like these, if you hit that icon there, you can immediately pick out which one you want and open it up. So now I can select the color socket and put it in there, and you can see that this has already been previously UV mapped, but we want to go ahead and tweak that because that's not quite what we want. So I can press Control right arrow and bring me to my UV window. Remember that you probably don't have that, but I've set it up specifically for that, and I have a video explaining how to do that if you want to see. So I think this is already in local view. Yes, it is. And so from the side view, I can press Tab to go into edit mode, select everything, and actually I was testing this earlier, so I'm just going to press reset so you can see the whole process. I can select the wow, okay, you know what, that's awkward. I jumped ahead of myself because I was testing that right before I started the video. So there we go. There, that's much better. Okay, so let's actually use the right object this time and the right texture. Alright, so as you can see, this is very, very stretched. It's not quite the same as this, obviously. It doesn't unwrap correctly, and one of the reasons is that the scale isn't applied. So let's go ahead and press Control A and apply the scale. And what that'll do is it'll just help it unwrap it a little bit better. But even then, it still kind of constrains it to this area, and it doesn't accurately represent the dimensions of this plane. So I can just scale this on the Y either direction until it fits approximately. I think that's close enough. And we also want to see this within the context because we want that little lip poking up just a bit. And so I can either scale it however, but I don't want to stretch it too much. So I can take this and just kind of grab it up until those little dirt spots are just barely peeking over the edge right there, and I like that just like it is. So if I press Control left arrow, I can go back to this, and you can see that now it's correctly mapped, but it looks very, very flat and very, very boring. So we're going to be adding some bump mapping. And I found a good way to do this is to duplicate the texture first, because what we want to use for our bump mapping is not the color data, we want to use the non-color data. And I haven't exactly figured out the specific differences between the two, but I know that if you use non-color data, it just creates a better bump map. So I can't tell you exactly why that is, but it's a tip, and it is what it is. So I'm going to go into vector and bump, stick the color in the height because that's what's going to determine how, what spots are the high spots and which spots are the low ones, and stick the normal into this normal. You can see that it doesn't work if I put it in there in the displacement because these are both labeled normal and have the little blue dots, so it's just kind of a visual indicator that that's where you need to stick it. Same thing with the color. You can notice those are yellow and you stick it into the other color sockets. So generally if there's colored ones, they always kind of go together. So you can see immediately that it really helped just make it a little bit more sharp, I guess, bring out some of the details. You don't want to make it too much, or else it'll just kind of start looking fake and not too good. So let's leave it at 0.1. I think that worked very well. So that was very, very simple, but that was a good place to start. So let's go ahead and do the next object. So I'm thinking now we should do the floor. So I'm going to select that, go into local view, and you can see that we still have the grass and stuff showing up. If your computer can't really handle rendering that at fast enough speed, you can uncheck these and just kind of get rid of the particles, but I'll keep them for now because it might be handy when we're texturing. Alright, so now we have this, and I'm going to make a new material and call this one the ground. And just like the wall, because it's a very similar material, I'm going to press Shift A, sorry, add in a texture, image texture, and asphalt damaged. Alright, so we're going to plug that one right in. And you can see this was apparently UV unwrapped beforehand by the author on blend swap, but that's okay because we can go ahead and unwrap it ourselves. So a good way to do this is just to press 7 on your numpad and press 5 to go into orthographic view, so it's all flat, and just press U and unwrap. You can also press U and project from view when you're in orthographic view like this, and it'll help give an accurate representation of the dimensions, so that's very nice. And it's also helpful if we have the right image selected. Okay, so here we have it, but I'm thinking since we have this kind of dirt buildup along there, and we also have some most of our plants back there, it would make more sense if we have the dirt kind of towards the wall side of things. So I'm just going to take the UVs here, press R for rotate 180 degrees, and that's just going to put our dirt along the back wall, which just really helps make it more realistic because that's where the grass is growing, and just looks better. So there we have our UV mapping, very simple so far. And since UV mapping is automatically applied to the image texture, we don't need to add a texture coordinate or anything, so that's always nice. And we can also go ahead and add our bump mapping now. So remember how we did that was vector and bump. I duplicated this so I could use the non-color data, plug that into the height, and plug that into the normal. And you can adjust the size, but I found that 0.1 works very, very well almost all the time. So I think that 0.1 is perfect in this case. And one thing that we can do now is, so that was kind of the bump for the small details, excuse me, for the little, the little bumps on there, but it doesn't give us the large crevices that would go there. And I have already made a texture in GIMP that looks like this, and this is going to serve two purposes, and I'll show you what those are. But first of all, I'm just going to jump into GIMP and show you how to make this. So here we have our texture, and conveniently the ground underneath is darker than the asphalt on top. So since this is the case, all we have to do is go into the color and threshold, and it's going to make a black and white image. And these here control how bright or dark is completely white, and over what value it becomes dark. So it's completely black and white, no gray tones or anything. So I'm going to move the black far enough away that we can have these solid stones, and I'm going to move this far enough. Yeah, I guess I don't have to move that far enough in, because that's just going to make it speckled, and we don't want that. So I'm going to move this so that we still have a little bit of white in here. It might be a little bit speckled, but mostly these are flat whites, and this is very, very dark blacks. So that's all that I did to get that texture. So I'm going to go ahead and load that in. So using a texture and image texture, open that up. Okay, so I do not know if we can combine bump maps. That's not sure if I can do that. But that's okay because we can go ahead and plug this color in because we want it to apply to the whole material. We're going to be adding something in just a second as well, but we can make that the one of the bump maps. And to see it more clearly, we can just take those out, so we see just the map. And there is very little difference between the color and non-color data. But you can see it just makes a very simple, not too detailed kind of map, whereas even if it was bump mapping, I don't think it would make that much difference. So let me go ahead and try it just to see. It'd help if I put it into the right socket. Okay, yeah, you can see that the two outcomes are identical, and neither of them look all that great. Let me go ahead and put these back. But what it does is it just helps kind of pop out those stones from the background. So that is it without, that is it with. And, you know, it helps a little bit, not a ton, but it's just the little extra things. But also, this is actually going to serve a secondary purpose, not just that. And what this is going to do is make it so we can have a little bit of water on the ground. Since I think this little spill here, I don't know what, I think it was a pile of trash in the original picture, but I didn't quite like that because there's no way to texture a pile of trash and make it look good. I've tried it many times and it never ever works. So I'm going to make this kind of a puddle. And it makes sense to have kind of a rain or wet ground when there's a lot of life growing up around it. So it just kind of makes sense to have that sort of wet feel to it. So then I can go ahead and add some water on the ground. And to do that, I'm going to add a shader and mix shader. And a glossy shader. And then you can see that I can take this color and just put it into the factor, and it's going to make only half of that, only one part of that mask glossy. And you can see that we need to switch these. We want the underneath to be glossy, but we don't want it glossy all the way. So what we can do, hopefully this node tree won't get too complicated, or messy. It's not really complicated, it's just kind of messy. I can go into the color and brightness contrast and just kind of lower the brightness. So you can see if I put this at 1, it's going to have horrible results, apparently. Yeah, so sometimes when you're messing with brightness and contrast, it really does screw with the whole image, and I'm not sure why there's not a clamp option, because there really should be, but a quick fix is just to use a mix with black and white, and that'll just clamp it automatically for you when you hit that clamp. So looks like I did that backwards, so we can just switch these two back. And there we go. And now when I lower the brightness, it's going to make it pretty much all glossy, and when I up the brightness, it's going to make none of it glossy. So that means when I lower this a little bit, it's going to make it a little bit glossy. So that's exactly what we want. We don't want it too glossy, we just want it just a little bit. And I think our roughness we want is about 0.05-ish. So we can see the reflection of some stuff, but won't be too crazy. And it looks like we have a little bit too much bump going on here. And since we don't have a control like we do over in this bump, when when we go into here, a really easy thing to do is just add a color and hue saturation node, and then we can just tweak the value and say set this to 0.25, and that's really going to lower the amount of bump, but still have it enough so it looks good. So there we have it. That's starting to look a lot better. It's not perfect, but we can come back and tweak it later if need be. You can see that there's a whole bunch of these kind of fireflies showing up, and that happens a lot when you add glossy and glass and what's it called, refraction nodes. And a way to fix all those bright spots coming up is going into the sampling, the light paths, and just hitting no caustics, and it'll clear those out. So it won't clear them out where they are legitimate like reflections, but it won't have any of the caustics showing up. And excuse me, there's something in my throat again. If you think they are too bright, you can always use a clamp. I almost always use a clamp of like 4 or something, and it just makes sure that none of them are too bright. Because one time I had, this is kind of a side note, but I had 1 pixel where I had a glare node, and even though it was set to like a value of 1 for its value, it glowed as bright as the sun, and it was the weirdest thing because it was 1 pixel. So I don't know. Use the clamp. That's about it there. Alright, so we can go ahead and move on to the next one if this is looking alright. So we can hit slash to go out of local view and just kind of view this with the wall. And you will immediately notice something, especially if I speed up the rendering by pressing Shift B and dragging a box. As this renders, you'll see that the floor is kind of a grayish color, and this is kind of a tannish color, and they do not match at all. They don't look similar, and they don't match. They don't look like they've been in the same area together. It looks like I just took 2 completely different textures and put them together, which is basically what I did, but they don't look like they go together. So what I can do is, first of all, I just noticed that I think this has a little bit too much bump, so I'm just change that to 0.075. There, okay. Is I want to decide whether I want this to be kind of the little bit more beigeish color, or I want it to be the more grayish, what kind of feel I'm going for. And I think for, this looks like a post-apocalyptic scene, or, some ruins or something. I think a nice gray would work very well. So the really easy thing I can do to fix this is, since this has a little bit too much of the beige inside of it, I can go into the wall texture or wall color, go to color, RGB curves, stick that in, and then under the blue, I can just move that up just a little bit to add more blues to compensate for the beige. And immediately that's looking a little bit more gray. Bump it up just a tad. And there we go. They now match. So far we're off to a pretty good start. Since we decided that we want the ground to be a little bit wet, let's go ahead and make this a puddle. So I'm going to add a new material and just call this puddle. And since we want to see the ground, I'm not going to go into local view, but I'm going to press Shift B and just concentrate my rendering there so it doesn't waste any time. And change this diffuse from that to glossy, because we want our puddle to be reflective. I don't use the glass because I like to have a little bit more control over my materials. So, I mean, you can use glass if you want, but you don't necessarily need it in this case. So I'm just going to use glossy, and we do want it to be a little bit see-through, so I'm going to add a mix node, or mix shader, and then add a transparent BSDF, and now we have it where it is half transparent and half glossy, so that if you zoom in, you can still see the stones underneath, but it's also reflective. And it's very, very subtle. you can't see the edge too well. I mean, you can a little bit, but it's not all that bad. And I think it really helps sell the image because you can see the reflection. Maybe it's a bit too much. If you want to make it less reflective, you can up this up like 0.75 or something. I think that looks good. And the roughness, I want it to be a little bit more rough, so I'm going to change that to 0.05. And what that does is just kind of blur the reflection a little bit. Maybe that's a bit much, 0.02. There we go, that looks good. And now we have our nice puddle. This is very, very simple, but we do have to pay close attention to what we're doing and just kind of tweak it until it looks good. And, you know, speaking of tweaks, I think it could use a little bit more reflectivity. So I know I just lowered it, but I'm going to go back to let's try 6. Because I want the grass reflection to show up a little bit more. Maybe the original 0.5 was perfect. Yeah, let's go with that. I think that looks good. And if you didn't turn off caustics earlier, now is where they're going to really show up. If I unchecked this now, you'll see that you have a whole lot of those white dots kind of everywhere, up there, and it just gets really messy. So I definitely recommend turning that on. So with the puddle, things like this is just meant to complement the image. It's not meant to, you know, stand out. So just make it blend in with the environment, make the transitions subtle. Same with the plants that I'm going to be working on. You don't want each piece to like stand out. You just want it to be, you know, just part of the environment. You want it to add to it and not, you know, dominate the scene or anything, make it too obvious. So as a general rule, when you're doing things that are, you know, like this and more realistic, try to go for subtle effects. Even if it's the focus of the scene, don't add too much bump. That sort of thing is just subtle is key. Subtle details are very, very good and really add up to make the image overall look great. So we can choose what we want to do next. How about this baseboard right there? So that looks good. And I am kind of lazy, so what I'm going to do is I'm just going to take these two faces, the only ones we see, and just press U and unwrap. Because we don't see any of the other ones, so it doesn't even matter really. So, not that. I don't think I've opened it yet. Okay, I think we're using that one. And it won't show up until we add it in our materials. So I'm going to add a new material for this, call it Baseboard. Even though it's not even made out of a board, I don't really know what to call it. Maybe I could call it curb. That sounds good. Now I'll add that image texture. I think it was that one. Plug that in, and now it should show up in the textures. So I can scale this up a little bit so that the edges are, you know, just visible just outside. And we don't want this texture to be, you know, dominating everything. It's just kind of a subtle, nice little cracks. It doesn't have to be super detailed, but it's just helping sell the image overall. So you can experiment on where you want the little cracks to be. Maybe something like that looks good. And maybe it looks a little bit stretched too much, so maybe I do want it to go like that. Just kind of play with it. That looks good. Now if I go ahead and render that, you can see that it does look good, but we do want to add some bump just for detail's sake. See vector bump. And since this isn't like a super important thing, we can just use the color. For that, it's not going to make a huge difference because it's just a really subtle background object. And even that looks a little bit too much, so I'm going to set that to 0.05. And that should be good. Next, you can see that it doesn't match the wall and the floor that we have, so I'm going to do the same thing as I did with the wall, where I change the color via the RGB curves. With the blue, just kind of get rid of those yellow hues. Just kind of make it more grayish. So there we go. Maybe a little bit less. Alright, so far our scene is looking pretty good. I think we've made some decent progress, so let's just keep going. I think next we should focus on some of these details down here. So I'm going to now do the grass. So I think the grass is on this thing, so it's nice to have separate layers open at the same time. That's really, really handy. So I can be rendering this layer and working on this one, and it all just kind of works out. So I'm going to select that so it renders faster, add a new material there, and I'm going to call this grass. Not ras, grass. There we go. And I just kind of have a default setup I use for grass and things like that, like leaves and all that. I explained it in my tutorial on Blender Cookie of how to make a realistic park scene or grass scene, something like that. So go ahead and look that up if you want for more in-depth on how to make nice grass. But here I'll just go over the basics. I'm going to be using the diffuse. Oh, come on. Shader. Mix shader. I'm going to be mixing this with some glossy. Then I'm going to be mixing that with a little bit of translucent. So we don't want too much glossy. Maybe just 0.1. I'll just set that to 0 so we can actually look at this for now. We don't want it too reflective, but a little bit reflective is always good. So I think that looks perfect. The diffuse, we can make this a nice green. Excuse me. And the glossy we're going to leave white. You can make it a little bit yellow if you want. Either way. Make this kind of a darker grass. Alright, that looks okay. And then we can just add a little bit of translucency. And that's pretty much all I'm going to do there. So it's not, I didn't go super in depth, but you can see that, it looks like grass. We have the different, aspects of it. We have the diffuse color. I wouldn't make it too saturated. That always looks funny. We have the diffuse, which is the main color behind it. The glossy, which is the kind of reflective sheen that you see a lot of the times on grass. I wonder if you can see a preview of it there. Not that well. And we have the translucency, which is kind of the sun shining through the back side of it, and it just kind of works out well. So that is our grass. I just want to see what happens if I bump that up even more. Okay, I'll leave it like that. I think that looks pretty good. And now we'll go ahead and mess with the sticks. So these are really small objects. You don't really see these in any sort of detail. So all I'm going to do is I'm going to make this diffuse a kind of a brownish, dark brownish color. But I do want some detail in there, so I'm going to take a texture, and I'm going to go ahead and use a wave texture. And then color, mix RGB. The first one is going to be that brown color, and then that's also going to be that brown color, but a little bit darker. So I can mix that in as the factor, and now we have a little bit of detail. It doesn't look all that great, but you know, just that amount of difference when seen from farther away is going to make the difference in your image, because when it just looks flat, it looks silly. But having just that little bit of texture in there helps it, you know, just helps it look a little bit better. So let's go ahead and do the pine needles. And actually, I'm going to delete that material, and I'm going to use the grass material, hit that 2, and just call this needles. But instead of using this exact same thing, I'm going to make it a little bit less translucent. And I'm going to make this color a lot darker. So where's a spot where there's a lot of them? Maybe like right there. So you can see that it's not, you know, super obvious where they are, but they do help just add a little bit more detail. You know, you could go ahead and add a lot more things like, you know, some trash or whatever, and that would help even more. But it's the little things. The devil is in the details is definitely a true saying. Alright, so I'm going to call this one rocks, or rock. Alright, now it's just a diffuse, but we can go ahead and do the same thing as we did with the sticks, which is just add a mix RGB. And our colors, I think we're going to use a kind of a gray and a slightly more brown gray. So nothing crazy. But then when we go and add a texture, let's use a noise texture. Stick the factor in there. And since these are going to be really small, we're going to want to bump the scale up to, or I don't know, we just want the texture to actually show up on the rocks. So I'm going to render just that. Okay, this is way too much detail. So you can see, this close, the bump mapping definitely looks bad. Okay, so we have that. You can barely see it, but we can go and change the color, brightness, contrast, and up the contrast just a little bit. That looks good. And now when we zoom out, we can tell that it's not quite a flat color, but it's, you know, just has a little bit of texture. That helps. So now that looks good. And with the other rock, I'm going to go ahead and copy that one, hit it 2, and just kind of slightly change these colors. Maybe I want it more reddish. I don't know. We could definitely go into a lot more detail with these, but since they're very, very small and make up a very little portion of the image, I'm not going to spend too much time worrying about something when we have more important details to cover and we don't have that much time. So let's see, we've covered all of this. Okay, so let's do the ivy next, I guess. Slash to go out of local view. Oh, that's weird, it changed the scene for me when I hit slash. That's kind of funny. Alright. One of the last few things is the ivy. Actually, this is going to be really quick. When I do this, all this is going to be is a diffuse, dark gray, shader, mix shader, and I'm going to add a glossy just to give it a little bit of a highlight. And make it mostly diffuse, so 0.2. So it has a little bit of a highlight, but it's mostly black, and that's all I'm going to do for that. Okay, so now for the ivy, because everything else is looking fairly good. Oh, not that. There we go. I'm going to, let's see. That's weird, it didn't change it when I was in local mode, but now it does. I'm going to take this leaf, and I'm going to use the grass material, make it a single user, and call it leaf. Okay. And now you can see it looks a lot like the grass, but there's a few important differences that we're going to make. I'm going to make the leaves a little bit darker, just so they blend in a little bit more with the background. And it's also going to contrast the red of the barrels quite nicely. The glossy is already set like pretty much how I want it, but I'm going to make it a little bit more translucent, and I'm going to change the translucent to be a little bit more yellow. So that'll just help the overall tint and help those leaves to kind of blend together well. So I think that looks good. And I think that automatically applied it to these over there. So let's see how those are doing. They look alright, not... I don't know. See, these over here look pretty good, but those don't look quite so good. Maybe it's a little bit too dark. A lot of this is just tweaking work. To be honest, I don't like this ivy on this wall at all. I think it has to do with the way the particles are facing. It just doesn't look very real. It's probably my fault. Actually, it is definitely my fault because I was the one who did it. But it's also kind of sticking away from the wall, which is bothering me. So you can see that a lot of these are just kind of sticking out of there. So I'm going to grab that ever so slightly. I don't know if that helped too much, but oh well. Okay, now I'm going to go ahead and select that again, move back to the first layer so I can work on the material. Add a little bit more glossy. Okay, so that definitely isn't perfect. We could work on that some more. One thing I would avoid is using PNG textures instead of actual geometry, because in Cycles it renders way slower. So I would recommend using actual materials like this instead of adding a image texture. So next we obviously need to change these branches. So ivy branches. And these, since we're hardly going to see them, I'm just going to make them a solid brown. And that's going to be good enough. Over here, I'm going to do the same thing. Ivy branches. Okay, so we are almost done. The posters, I'm going to not do in this video tutorial because you do it literally exactly like I did the wall and the floor. So I'm going to leave you to do that because I am confident that you can do something like that. These, I think, are they? What material are they? Let's go and give them the ivy material. Wait, then what material is this? Leaf. Oh, there we go. Okay. So, lastly, we're going to do the barrels. And we're going to texture them first. So, let's give them a material. I'm just going to call them barrel. And then an image texture so we can see it when we move to the next window out layout. Texture, image texture. Open it up. I chose this texture specifically because it is nice and long and can wrap around the barrel, and it's nice and grungy, so exactly what we're looking for. And in this view, I'm going to go into edit mode, and you can see these UVs are all messed up. And I can press. Actually, what I'm going to do is I'm going to go into side view, and a really quick way to do this is, since this is a cylindrical object, I can just press U and cylinder projection, and that works perfectly except for one small place, which I'll show you in a sec. metal painted. There we go. So I can select everything, move it down there, and scale it on the X so it looks a little bit better wrapped around there to minimize the stretching. So you can see that looks good, except for just on the top here, which it looks a little bit stretched. And what we can do to fix that is just to select these two things there, those two, there we go, those two edge loops, and take this line. I'm selecting the row by pressing Alt and then clicking, and then just grab that on the Y, bring that down, and that's gonna fix your stretching. So there we go. This I'm going to also add that material, barrel, and I guess we also have to UV map it. Looks like it's already done for us, so that is very cool, except for this is not UV mapped at all, which we don't even see that, but just for the sake of doing it, I'm going to unwrap that, and it's not a perfect fit, but since we don't see it, it'll do fine. Okay, so now we have the color applied, and I'm going to go into local view again so we can see it a lot faster. Okay, so it's already looking good. We got to add some butt mapping on those scratches, so I'm going to do the same thing as we did with the ground, color, non-color data. Stick that in there, and you can see that it's going the wrong way, so I can negative 0.01 or 0.05 because I don't want too much. And that's just going to help put in those scratches there, and it'll help even more when I use the shader, mix shader, and mix it with some glossy. And obviously we don't want too much. And is that seam just from the light, or is that from the textures? Okay, that's just from the light. Okay. That just looks really funny, but that's alright, because in the scene it looks much better. Okay. And the glossy, we want it to be a little bit more shiny, so let's go with 0.01. And just kind of make it so we have mostly diffuse with just a little bit of that shininess in there. And maybe even up the strength of this, negative 0.1, so we can see the reflectiveness with the shiny. Okay, that looks good. Lastly, I'm going to add the little decal. And the way I'm going to do that is, oh, hold on. Duplicate that image texture, open up a new one, and choose our decal. Make sure that's a diffuse, and we want to mix it with that based on the alpha, and you see that's definitely not mapped how we want. So I don't want it to repeat any. I don't know how we can get it to not do that, but let's go ahead and unwrap it. So select everything with our acid sign there. We can just scale this up. Let's select everything this time. But we don't want to mess up that. So actually, sorry, what I'm going to go ahead and do is input texture coordinate. If I put in generated, nope, UV works best. Then I can change the mapping over here. So you can see it's stretched a little bit along the x-axis. So I can stretch it back like that, and that's gonna help. Um, what? Geez, what did I do before? Oh, okay. This is what it was. This is kind of tricky. Okay, so I'm gonna add a new UV map, and I'm gonna call this decal. There we go. That's better. So now, let's see. I just want to make sure that one is selected. So when I go ahead and unwrap this, it's going to be under the decal settings. I want that positioned right there, but I don't want it to repeat. So I think there's an edit or an option here to not make it overlap, but let me see here real quick. Shoot, I know there's something here, so let me just pause the recording and I'll come back in just a sec. Alright, so I took a little bit of a break there, but now I'm back and I figured it out. What you have to do is use a, like I was thinking, another UV map, hit it, pass it through a mapping node, and by these minimum and maximum, it then constrains it to just that one. So that is how you do it, and that should be all for that. It looks a little bit stretched in my opinion, so I can scale that on the X, and notice how that does not affect the UV map for this one. So, and we put in the decal map by adding in an attribute node, which is just the input and then attribute, and then we type the name of that UV map, plug the vector into there, and then keep going. So that's how it's done, and it works pretty well. So there you have it. I think that is everything. Is now fully textured and materialed, if that's even a word, except for the posters, which I am very confident you can do by yourself. So that is it for this tutorial. I didn't go too in depth, but there was quite a lot to cover, and I'm sure you can understand. So one thing, or just a couple things I want you to be aware of is, as you're choosing textures and stuff, keep in mind the context at all times. Make sure that they match each other, so they look good and complement each other, and just make sure that the details are subtle. You don't want too much, bump mapping, or else it's going to look bad, or you don't want too little. Just keep in mind the subtle things really help make the picture, and that these posters that are sticking through the wall are looking very bad. But anyway, I'll go ahead and fix that before I do the final rendering for the preview of the video. But at this point, I'm going to say thank you for watching. I hope you learned something. The next time I'm going to go through compositing, rendering, and then just finishing it up, giving up the few key points and summing up what we learned. So that's all for this tutorial. I'll see you next time, and thanks for watching.